When Javier and I were driving to his father's house for the weekend, I imagined a common country house where we would spend time away from the hustle and bustle of the city. For me, it was just a family reunion, a small step in our seemingly solid and predictable relationship. But it turned out to be the opposite. From the moment we arrived at the old mansion on the outskirts of town, I felt a slight shudder inside me, as if the air around us began to thicken and an invisible force passed through my mind. Raphael's house was in the middle of a dense forest hidden from prying eyes. As if it were a forgotten fragment of the past, it was a house that breathed history, and I felt like its walls had seen too much. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle of the leaves outside the window filled me with a strange mix of uneasiness and curiosity. Inside, the house seemed cozy but mysterious. The dark old paintings on the walls, the antique furniture, and the fireplace that seemed to have never been lit in long, created an atmosphere full of contradictions. Raphael received us at the door. Tall, with gray hair and deep wrinkles, he looked much older than I had imagined, but in his eyes there was something that immediately attracted me. It was something more than a simple warmth of welcome. His eyes were full of secrets, like an ocean in which one could sink, and they looked at me for longer than necessary. This worried me, but I quickly looked away without wanting to think about what that could mean. We entered the house, and during the first dinner I began to notice this strange, indescribable atmosphere between us. Javier, as always, was himself, talked about his work and life in the city without noticing anything out of the ordinary, but for me it was difficult to concentrate on the food or the conversation. With each moment I felt how my attention slowly deviated from him to Raphael, to his voice, to his gestures, towards that calm confidence that emanated from him. A casual look, that was all it took for my inner world to shake. I caught him looking at me from the other side of the table, and it seemed to me that he saw to the depths of my soul, as if he understood something that no one else could know at that moment. I almost forgot where I was and who was sitting next to me. My heart began to beat faster, and I had to concentrate to return to reality. It was something on the edge of right, on the edge of dangerous, but I couldn't understand exactly what it was. After dinner, Javier suggested going out for a walk in the yard. He was in a good mood. He talked animatedly about his work and his plans for the future, but I couldn't concentrate. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed how Raphael was standing by the window looking at us, as if he was watching me, or was it just my imagination? I began to wonder what that feeling was that I felt being close to him, why I couldn't stop thinking about his gaze and his calm, and that incomprehensible force that seemed to attract me to him. When we went back, and I noticed that Raphael had retired to his workshop, which relieved me. I spent the rest of the night. I struggled to get rid of those thoughts, but I tried to ignore them, assuring myself that it was just a temporary confusion. This couldn't be real. It was just tiredness, tension that comes from being in a new place, surrounded by new people. I went to bed with a weight on my chest, not fully understanding what was happening, but knowing one thing: Raphael, I had touched something deeply hidden inside me, something that I myself was not yet ready to admit. The morning at Raphael's house began quietly, but inside me there was a storm. I woke up with the feeling of not having slept at all. Every moment of the dream was impregnated with his image of that strange attraction that I was trying to get rid of. I looked at Javier, who was already I was in the kitchen making breakfast. Everything seemed normal: the aroma of coffee, the sizzling of oil in the pan, the soft light coming through the old curtains, but inside me anxiety was growing. Raphael wasn't in the kitchen. I felt relief, although I knew that feeling would be brief. He was somewhere nearby. The whole house seemed impregnated with his presence. I sat at the table next to Javier, who smiled at me as always. His voice was warm and familiar, like a soft blanket that covers you on a cold day. He was talking about how he planned to spend the day: a little walk to the river, a hike through the woods. It seemed like a perfect day in nature, but my mind was somewhere else. "You didn't sleep well?" he asked while he poured me coffee. I was startled words and nodded, smiling. Of course I couldn't tell him the truth. What could I tell him? I woke up feeling like someone was watching me, that I could barely handle the wave of emotions that covered me completely. I couldn't tell him that not even I understood what was happening, but something was clear. What I felt for Raphael was dangerous and possibly irreparable. As if he had heard my thoughts, Raphael appeared in the kitchen like a shadow, crossing the threshold without making a noise. He entered silently. His movements were calm and sure, like someone who had already decided everything. His gaze rested on me a little more than necessary, and I felt a tremor inside me again. I quickly looked away, hoping that Javier would not notice that little scene "Good morning, Raphael," said. His voice resonated low and calm as soon as I managed to respond. Everything inside me screamed that I had to get out of there, look for any excuse not to be near him, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. His presence, his smell, his calm confidence attracted me to him as if he were a magnet. I realized how absurd it sounded. Everything that was happening seemed ridiculous to me, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. "Absurd, Laura, you look tense," Javier commented when we were ready to go out for a walk. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I just didn't sleep well," I excused myself, hoping he wouldn't insist. Javier wasn't. He was used to seeing me like this. Usually I was the one who gave him support, always confident and calm, but now I felt like my whole inner world was falling apart. We walked along a path that led to the forest. Javier was ahead, talking with enthusiasm as always. Without noticing my absence in the conversation, I tried to concentrate on the sounds of the forest, in the smell of the pines, in the soft breeze that played with my hair, but each step was difficult, as if something inside me was resisting all of this. "Raphael will join us later," Javier said suddenly when we stopped next to the river. He said he wanted to work on something in his workshop. I felt like that news gave me a strange feeling of relief. I knew I wanted to be away from him, although I also knew that it would only be a temporary respite. "What do you think of my father?" Javier asked, suddenly taking me by surprise. I stood still, searching for the words. My heart started beating faster and I felt a warm wave of anxiety rising inside me. "It's awesome," was all I could say. "Yes," Javier smiled, not noticing my confusion. "He's a special person, always has been. Somewhat complicated, but with a big heart." I nodded, trying to hide my emotions. We continued walking along the river, but I barely listened to what Javier was saying. My head was full of thoughts about what was happening to me, how I had gotten here. I tried to understand how and when everything changed. Just one night, one look, and I could no longer control my feelings. It seemed wrong, even unnatural. When we returned home, Raphael was sitting on the porch. His calm seemed to defy everything that was happening inside me. He looked up and our eyes met once more. At that moment I realized that I could no longer ignore what was happening. Several days had passed since we returned home. The hustle and bustle of the city completely enveloped me, but the memories of that weekend would not leave my mind. Raphael, his house, the look that pierced me. I tried to return to my life, immerse myself again in the daily routine, but nothing helped. Everything around me began to seem strange and gray. Javier, work, friends, everything faded into the background compared to the emotions that invaded me in those days. At some point I realized that I could not continue living that way. I needed to distract myself, occupy my mind with something like that. So I decided to take a walk through the center of the city. The streets were bathed in bright sunlight, and it seemed that everything around me reminded me how life could be simple and carefree. I tried to concentrate on that, but even in the middle of the crowd of passers-by, the noise of the cars and the music coming out of the cafes opened my mind. Always came back to the same point. I stopped at a small coffee shop on the corner and ordered a cappuccino. I normally came here to relax, read a book, or just enjoy the quiet, but that day I didn't feel like doing it. I was absent-mindedly looking at the passers-by, turning the cup in my hands, when suddenly I felt a gaze on me. I turned around and saw him, Raphael. As soon as our eyes met, time seemed to stop. He was on the other side of the street, in the middle of the crowd, but he stood out among everyone as if his presence was so strong that it was impossible not to notice it. My heart skipped a beat, and suddenly I felt like everything I had tried to forget was enveloping me again. We were like that for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, until he started walking towards me, Laura said. When he came closer, his voice sounded so calm and sure, as if he owned the whole world around him. I didn't know what to answer. All my determination to keep my distance collapsed the moment I saw him again. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind, but none could drown the wave of emotions that was rising inside me. "What are you doing here?" I barely managed to articulate, hoping it sounded casual and carefree. "Business." His answer was simple and concise, but he didn't take his eyes off me. "And you?" "Alone. Taking a walk. I needed fresh air." My voice betrayed me, sounding too unsure. He smiled lightly. In that second I felt like he could see through me, understand each of my doubts, every internal conflict I had been fighting the last few days. We were standing in the middle of the street, and time slowed down again. The passers-by passed around us like shadows, but I didn't notice them. He was the only one there. "Would you like to walk a little with me?" he proposed, and although there was nothing special in his words, I felt that behind them there was something more. I nodded, although an inner voice screamed at me to stop. We began to walk through the narrow streets, and the conversation flowed on its own. Raphael talked about his work of life away from the city, but each of his gestures, each look, cast a shadow over our words. I felt like the tension between us was growing, an invisible tension that grew stronger with each minute. I could not understand why he had such a strong effect on me, but I could no longer deny it. When we reached a small plaza with a fountain, Raphael stopped and turned to me, his eyes so deep and mysterious met mine again. I have wanted to talk to you for a long time, he said suddenly with a serious tone about what my heart began to beat faster, anticipating something important about what is happening between us. I feel like you understand it too. His words resonated like thunder in a clear sky. I froze. Those words confirmed all my fears, all my doubts. I couldn't deny that something was going on between us from the moment we met, but I had tried to ignore it. I hoped it was just a passing feeling. Now it had become a reality. You are wrong, I whispered, not believing my own words. There is nothing between us. Raphael leaned slightly towards me, his gaze relentless. You feel the same as me, Laura. Don't deny it. We both know it. My head was spinning from his words. I couldn't understand how he had allowed me to go so far, but it was too late. Raphael's words penetrated me like a poison, spreading throughout my being. I was in front of him, feeling how the walls I had built with so much effort were crumbling. You know this is wrong, I tried to object, but my confidence was fading. Bad. Raphael smiled. What is right in this world? We just follow our desires, Laura. Everything the rest is an illusion. No, I knew what to answer. Too many things were going on inside me. I felt cornered, but at the same time something inside me pulled me towards him so strongly that it was impossible to ignore it. When Javier announced that he would have to go on a business trip for a few weeks, I felt a strange relief. We were sitting at the kitchen table. He was pouring coffee and I was trying to act normal. My hands were shaking slightly, but I attributed it to tiredness and too much caffeine. Javier was excited about his upcoming trip. He said it was an opportunity to advance his career, to expand his horizons. I smiled and nodded, but inside he was raging a real storm. As soon as he left, the house was enveloped in an unusual silence. For the first time in a long time, I was left alone with my thoughts and feelings. I tried to occupy myself with daily tasks, reading, cleaning, working, but nothing gave me satisfaction in my mind. There was only one question: what was I going to do with Raphael? I thought that if I left everything behind, it would happen, that I could simply forget our conversation as if it were an unimportant episode in my life and not bring up that subject again. But with each hour of solitude, I realized how much I wanted to see him again. It seemed that the memories of that walk through the city beat in me like a deep wound that would not heal. His words would not leave my head, and I surprised myself unconsciously looking for excuses to contact him. Several days passed before I dared to write to him. Raphael, as always, he was completely calm. Yes, Laura is coming to help me with a project, he replied with total confidence in his voice. My face flushed with shame and I feared that she could suspect something, but the neighbor just smiled and started talking about her trivial matters while I struggled to regain my composure. Raphael, as usual, remained imperturbable, sure of himself. That was his art, hiding the true intentions behind an apparent calm. When she left, she exhaled in relief, but the uneasiness continued to grow inside me. How long could we continue like this? How long could I lie to Javier? At that moment, I realized that sooner or later everything would come to light and the consequences would be devastating. The next day, when I returned home, I received a call from Javier informing me that he would return from the trip earlier than expected. My heart skipped a beat. I felt panic envelop me completely. I was not ready to see him again. I was not prepared to pretend that everything was fine. Did you miss me? He asked with a smile in the voice. Of course. I tried to sound natural, but my mind was in chaos. I knew time was running out. I was trying to arm myself, hoping I could hide everything somehow, but every encounter with Raphael made that more and more impossible. That night when Javier came home, I tried to act as usual. We had dinner, we talked as we always did. He was still the same kind and cheerful man, while I felt how guilt was consuming me inside, hidden behind a fake smile. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, Javier asked me to use my phone to look something up. It was unexpected, and I hurriedly handed him the phone without thinking about what I could have left on it. A few minutes later, I heard his low voice from the kitchen. Laura, what is this? I froze in place. My heart stopped, and I knew that this was the moment I had so feared. I walked into the kitchen and saw Javier holding my phone with the last message from Raphael on the screen. Who is it? He asked with a mix of confusion and pain in his voice. The time stopped. I stood there unable to find words. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. At that moment I knew we couldn't go on any longer, which kept me from breathing and finding the words to explain to myself who Laura is. His voice was low, almost suffocated, as if he still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had been revealed before him. I took a deep breath, but I couldn't find what to say. All the excuses I had made up for myself crumbled in an instant silence for a few seconds. Then he threw the phone on the table and turned around abruptly. His movement was fast and definite. I knew he wasn't the type to explode in a fit of rage at. On the contrary, his silence, his distancing had always seemed more terrifying to me than any fight. It was the foreshadowing of something much more serious. Yaft it up. His voice sounded sharp like a whiplash. He turned to me. His eyes were full of a mixture of pain and rage. I deserve an explanation. Or what is going on? I suddenly felt that the room was getting smaller. The walls were closing in. The air was thick. Every minute felt like torture. Unbearable. Everything I had tried to hide, all my secrets that I had tried so hard to keep away from Javier, were coming to light. I let myself fall on a chair, feeling my legs tremble. My heart was beating hard. I understood that I could not continue lying all this time. I had deceived myself and him, convincing myself that I could continue leading this double life without destroying anything. But now that was impossible. Javier, I started without knowing how to find the right words. I don't know how to tell you. You are deceiving me. His question was direct, without beating around the bush. His eyes were fixed on me. In them the pain that tore him apart inside. My lips trembled and I tried to find some excuse, but I couldn't. The words got stuck in my throat and the only thing I could do was nod silently, feeling the tears begin to fill my eyes. It was the only thing I could do. Javier grabbed the back of a chair as if it were the only thing that kept him standing. His breathing was ragged and I could see how he tried to hold back the tears, fighting not to lose control with who. His voice trembled just like him. Who is this? Was the moment I feared the most. I knew I could no longer hide anything. This was the end, and as much as it hurt, the truth had to come out. Rafael, I whispered, barely breathing. Those two words sounded like thunder in a clear sky. The room was filled with a deafening silence. Javier remained motionless, as if he had been struck by lightning. No. He moved, he didn't speak, he just looked at me with an expression that I couldn't bear. What did you say? He finally said, not believing what he had heard. It's Rafael. I repeated a little louder, but my voice was still weak. Each word was like a knife stuck in my soul. Your father. The silence that followed those words was unbearable. Javier stood paralyzed, his face paled, and I saw how he tried to process what he had just heard. It was as if he had received a blow straight to the heart. Are you kidding? He whispered, shaking his head. This is a cruel joke, right? I couldn't look him in the eyes. I knew that everything had ended. The bridges that I had tried so desperately to keep standing, now they were completely destroyed. No, Javier, it's the truth. I made a mistake. At that moment, something in Javier suddenly broke. He stood up from his seat, his face twisted with rage, and he hit the table with his fist with such force that it made me shudder. I had never seen it before, so I knew that this was the end. My father screamed without holding back. My own father. How could you, Laura? How could he? He knew that nothing he could say would fix the situation. I was prepared for the worst, but I couldn't even imagine what was about to be unleashed upon me with such force. Javier grabbed his jacket and ran out of the house without giving me a chance to explain myself. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in a frozen silence. I didn't know where he had gone or what he planned to do, but I knew one thing: I would never be the same again. Anxiety grew inside me. My hands trembled and I felt an unbearable pressure on my chest. Everything had collapsed. Everything I had tried to keep intact was now destroyed, but the worst was yet to come. An hour later, I received a message from Rafael. He is coming here. We have to talk. Heart stopped. I knew that this would be a meeting from which there would be no turning back. When I read Rafael's message, my heart began to beat with so much strength that I thought it would come out of my chest. It was the omen of something terrible. I couldn't imagine what would happen when Javier and Rafael they met. They were father and son, two of the most important people in my life, and I had destroyed everything that united them. I went out into the street and stood looking at the road. The dark clouds seemed to accumulate right above me, threatening to unleash a storm. At that moment I understood that I couldn't just stay waiting without doing anything. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Everything in me mentally trembled. I repeated over and over again, I just hope they don't hurt each other. Everything I had done, everything that had seemed right and justifiable at the time, had now become a catastrophe. I knew I had gone too far, that there was no turning back. I myself had brought us to this point. With each passing minute, the Panic grew inside me. Finally, no, I couldn't stand it anymore and got in the car. I didn't know what I would say when I got there. What can you say in a situation like that? I'm sorry, it was a mistake. That wouldn't fix anything, but I couldn't just stay home and wait for everything to fall apart. When I got to Raphael's house, the air was filled with a strange calm, like the stillness that precedes a storm. I got out of the car with my heart beating fast and my legs shaking. The house looked empty, distant. There was only one light on in a window, the one in the living room. I approached and heard muffled voices. Javier and Raphael were already talking. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The feeling of anxiety tightened my chest. I opened the door, which as always was unsecured. Inside, the silence was deep, like before a storm. Each step I took resonated in my ears like a deafening echo. How could you? The voice of Javier was full of anger and pain. I felt my whole body tense up. When I heard his words, I came closer but stopped in the doorway, not daring to enter the room. Javier, you must understand, Raphael began. But his voice was calm, almost distant, that only made Javier more angry. Understand. His voice was on the verge of a scream. You took everything from me. You betrayed me, Father. How am I supposed to understand? I could feel the tension in the room growing. I knew something irreversible was about to happen. We both made mistakes, Raphael said in a low voice, so low I could barely hear it. Mistakes, that word seemed too small for what had happened. They weren't simple mistakes. It was a betrayal that couldn't be erased, not with time or with apologies. You were always cold. Javier got closer to Raphael. His voice trembled. You were never a real father. You were always far away, as if you couldn't let me into your life, and now you have taken away the most precious thing from me. Raphael looked at Javier, and I saw how his face was normally so calm. He showed an expression of pain. I can't explain it, said Raphael. What happened between Laura and me was not intentional. I don't even understand how it started, but you should know that I never wanted to betray you. Raphael's words floated in the air, heavy like a burden, impossible to ignore. I saw how Javier clenched his fists. His face turned red with fury. You don't understand what you've done, Javier whispered with clenched teeth. You have destroyed everything. You have destroyed our family. I will never be able to look at you as a father. Raphael took a step forward, trying to get closer to Javier, but he suddenly stepped back. Don't touch me, Javier shouted, pushing Raphael with such force that he staggered and crashed into the wall. I couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. I ran to the living room, but it was too late. Javier realized what he had done. He froze for a moment, then took the keys and headed for the door. Javier, wait, I screamed. I tried to stop him. He turned to me, his eyes full of hate and pain. You, his voice trembled, and he couldn't finish the sentence. I don't want to see you ever again. He left the house with a slam that echoed in the silence. Everything was calm. Raphael stood next to the wall, breathing with difficulty. I approached him, trying to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. Everything is over, he said, finally lowering my gaze. I have lost him. I kneel beside him, feeling like the world around me was falling apart. Raphael was right. Everything was over. Several days passed since Javier left Raphael's house, and each one of those days seemed endless. I tried to get in touch with him. I called him. I wrote him a message. But everything was in vain. He disappeared from my life as if he had never existed, and that feeling of loss tore me apart. Inside, it was as if I had lost not only him but also a part of myself. Raphael's house that had once seemed like a refuge became a prison in every corner. I felt the traces of what we had destroyed. Our relationship that at first was so exciting and passionate now was a heavy burden. I looked at Raphael, and in his eyes I saw the same emptiness that I felt inside me. His attitude, before so sure and dominant, was now broken, and although I tried to hide it, I knew that he was also consumed by the feeling of loss. One night I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset that seemed too bright for the darkness I felt in my soul. Raphael came out. His steps were soft, almost imperceptible. He sat down next to me, and between us a heavy silence settled. Do you think he will ever forgive us? I asked, without taking my eyes off the horizon. Raphael sighed deeply. His face was more serious than ever. I don't think so. Laura is not the type of person who can let something like that go. Those words sounded like a sentence. I knew he was right, but deep inside me I still held a small spark of hope. I hoped that time would heal the wounds, that one day Javier would find the strength to return to us, his father, to his life. But with each passing day that hope faded more. He continued speaking. His voice became rough. I don't know if I will ever be able to forgive myself for what I did. I always considered myself a strong person, but this has destroyed me. I turned to him and saw for the first time how he let out his vulnerability. In his eyes tears shone, and that image broke me completely. Raphael, the man who always seemed unbreakable, was now Broken, I never thought I would go this far, I said, feeling my own tears beginning to flow, but now everything is destroyed. We have destroyed everything we had. We sat together deep in thought, but we both felt the weight of our own mistakes. It was a silent admission that there would be no turning back. Everything we had built together was now in ruins, and no one could fix it. A few more days passed and life continued, but inside me nothing changed. One morning when I woke up, Raphael was gone. His room was empty, his things carefully packed, and on the table was a note. My heart stopped for a moment, and I took the piece of paper on which he had written a few lines. Laura, I can't stay here. This place is steeped in pain and guilt. I don't know where I will go, but I can't keep living in this hell. Goodbye. Raphael. My world fell apart once again. I sat holding that letter in my hands, realizing that I was now completely alone. Raphael was gone. Javier had disappeared, and now I was left alone with my thoughts and the consequences of my actions. I looked at the empty house, and that emptiness seemed to me a reflection of what it was happening inside me. I had trouble breathing. I got up, went out into the street, and felt the cold wind hitting my face. Everything around me seemed so empty and lifeless. No one would come back. No one would be there to fix what we had destroyed. I thought that passion and love would fill the emptiness I felt. But now I realized that this passion had only destroyed everything in its path. I was left alone in this chaos that I myself had created. The path in front of me was empty, like my future. I understood that I had to walk this path alone.